Imagine having pain in your arm, looking for relief, being handed a miracle cure, and, without realizing it, slowly drinking your own destruction one tiny dose at a time. It wasn't bitter-tasting poison. It wasn't something that burned on contact. It was water. Water sold as energy, vitality, youth, and healing. And that's how a wealthy, famous, privileged man went down in history in the most grotesque way imaginable, as the man who drank radiation until his body began to rot from the inside out. And the scariest part is that he wasn't ignorant. He wasn't some reckless drifter or someone living on the margins of society. He was a millionaire, a well-known athlete, and a member of America's elite. His name was Eben Byers. And for years, he drank a product called Radithor, radioactive water marketed as a medical breakthrough. But this story isn't just about one man. It's about an entire era when science was misunderstood, advertising shouted louder than caution, and the word radioactive sounded like another word for progress. Until reality came to collect, and it collected in the most brutal way possible. Today, when we hear the word radiation, the reaction is almost automatic: fear, danger, contamination, cancer. But in the early 20th century, the feeling was almost the opposite. After Marie and Pierre Curie discovered radium in 1898, many people began to see radioactivity as something mysterious, modern, and almost magical. It represented the future. And when something seems like it belongs to the future, people start believing it can cure the present. That was the atmosphere that gave rise to radioactive creams, tonics, patches, toothpastes, home devices that supposedly energized water, and even drinks containing radioactive elements. Radium became a sales pitch. Instead of being treated with caution, it was packaged as luxury, innovation, and bottled health. And the more sophisticated the promise sounded, the more people believed it. That's where Eben Byers comes in. Because out of all the people swept up in this radioactive craze, no case became more symbolic, more shocking, or more revealing than his. He became living proof, and then dead proof, that not every scientific discovery is ready to become something you can buy off a shelf. Eben Byers was not some anonymous victim. He was an industrialist, a high society figure, and a champion amateur golfer in the United States. He had money, influence, and access to what was considered the most modern medicine of his time. In other words, he was exactly the kind of person who could help legitimize a dangerous trend. Because when a rich man believes in a cure, plenty of people around him start believing in it too. The tragedy began in 1927, when Byers injured his arm after falling from an upper berth on a train following a social event connected to the Harvard-Yale football game. The pain lingered, and a doctor in Pittsburgh recommended Radithor to help with his recovery. The product was sold in small bottles and promised benefits that went far beyond pain relief. It was advertised as a metabolic stimulant, an energy restorer, and a remedy for countless ailments. Now pay attention to the detail that makes this even more absurd. Byers didn't take 1 or 2 doses. According to historical accounts, he started in December 1927 and averaged about 3 bottles a day over the next 2 years. He said he felt energized, toned up, as if he had discovered some secret source of strength. And as happens with every great illusion, the early signs seemed to confirm the lie. He became so convinced that he started recommending the drink to other people. He gave cases of Radithor to friends, offered it to women he was dating, and even gave it to his racehorses. That detail matters because belief in miracle cures almost never stays contained within one person. When someone with status believes, the fantasy gains witnesses, defenders, and new consumers. The madness spreads dressed up as confidence. But the body does not negotiate with advertising. The human body may take time to respond, but eventually, it responds. And the problem with radium is that it doesn't act like an ordinary poison. Once inside the body, it behaves somewhat like calcium. That means it can settle into the bones and teeth, where it keeps emitting radiation from within and causing damage over time. It isn't an instant attack. It is silent, continuous, invisible destruction. That may be the most terrifying part of this story. When you think of danger, you imagine something the body recognizes right away: fever, sharp pain, burning, fainting. But in Byers' case, the enemy seemed harmless. It was bottled water. It looked innocent. It was sold by a market exploiting the public's fascination with science. The product seemed elegant. The effects seemed positive, and that is exactly why it was deadly. At some point, the promise began to collapse. Byers stopped drinking Radithor in 1930 when his teeth began falling out. From there, the story enters a realm that sounds like body horror fiction. His bone structure began to deteriorate severely. The damage was not superficial. It was skeletal. It was internal. It was as if his body was giving way from the foundation up. When investigators came to interview him at his home during the inquiry into the company behind the product, the account became infamous for its brutality. Nearly his entire upper jaw, except for 2 front teeth, and much of his lower jaw had already been removed. There were also reports of bone disintegration and holes forming in his skull. It is the kind of description that still shocks people today because it shows a slow public death that no amount of wealth or status could hide. Byers died in 1932 from radium poisoning after consuming an enormous amount of Radithor, around 1,400 bottles, according to the most commonly cited historical accounts. His death was not just an individual tragedy. It became a headline, a warning, a symbol of the moment when the radioactive fantasy collided with biological reality. And once that happened, no one could keep pretending it was just alternative medicine. But this story becomes even more disturbing when you look at the man behind the product. Radithor was sold by William J. Bailey, a businessman who used the image of scientific authority to make money from radioactive formulas. The central issue here is not only one man's fraud. It is the environment that allowed him to thrive: weak regulation, aggressive advertising, and a public dazzled by anything that sounded modern. And that combination still feels disturbingly familiar. The substance changes, the packaging changes, the language changes. But the mechanism is the same: an exaggerated promise, the aesthetic of innovation, and an audience desperate for a quick fix. The story of Eben Byers doesn't survive because it is bizarre. It survives because it is recognizable. In every generation, someone shows up offering a miracle with a technical-sounding name, attractive packaging, and a hidden risk. After Byers' case drew public attention, the reputation of radioactive cures began to collapse. In 1931, the Federal Trade Commission had already ordered Bailey's company to stop making deceptive therapeutic claims about Radithor and to stop saying the product was harmless. Byers' death helped cool the public's enthusiasm for this kind of cure and became one of the episodes that pushed the United States toward stricter controls over health products. A few years later, in 1938, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act marked a major regulatory turning point in the United States, strengthening consumer protection. The law was not created solely because of Byers, but his tragedy became part of the chain of events that exposed the human cost of a market far too loose to handle products being sold as medicine. Sometimes regulation only grows up after someone dies in a way that is impossible to ignore. And maybe that is the most powerful part of this story. Eben Byers did not die because he intentionally set out to do something dangerous. He died because he trusted. He trusted the doctor. He trusted the advertising. He trusted the spirit of an era that confused novelty with truth. And that kind of mistake is much more human than we like to admit. Because deep down, everyone wants to believe there is an easy, elegant, fast solution to pain. But perhaps the darkest detail of all is this: radiation did not kill Eben Byers all at once. It took up space inside him. It replaced what supported his body. It turned his own bones into a source of destruction. The man who drank radiation did not fall because of one sudden accident. He was dismantled from within, day after day, sip after sip, until he became a historical warning against the seduction of false cures. And that is the true story of the man who drank radiation thinking he was buying health, youth, and energy. In the end, he bought his own death sentence. And maybe that is why this case still feels so relevant. It reminds us that not every promise dressed up as science is real science. Sometimes what looks like progress is just marketing in a more sophisticated package. So go ahead and hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because here we don't just tell strange stories. We dive into them until we find the most absurd, darkest, and most fascinating part of each one. And in the next video, I'll see you for another one of those stories that sounds made up, but actually happened.